China's rapidly growing influence in Africa is no longer quiet, behind-the-scenes development. It's a full-scale transformation of global trade, resources, and geopolitics. Over the last 2 decades, Beijing has invested billions of dollars across the African continent, funding railways, highways, ports, power plants, and mining operations. What once began as a small diplomatic outreach has evolved into a strategic partnership that is reshaping the economic balance between the global South and the established powers in the West. While the United States and Europe have often spoken of Africa in terms of aid and development assistance, China has taken a different route, investing directly in infrastructure, securing long-term access to natural resources, and embedding itself in the daily economic life of multiple African nations. This deep involvement has given China an unprecedented foothold on a continent that many analysts call the final frontier for large-scale economic growth. But it has also sparked growing concern in Washington, Brussels, and other Western capitals, where officials now warn that the West is ceding its influence to Beijing in a region that will be home to over 2.5 billion people by 2050. China's entry into Africa was built on promises that resonated with African leaders: no political strings attached, no lectures on governance, and no interference in domestic affairs. In exchange, Beijing sought access to critical resources such as oil, cobalt, copper, lithium, and rare earth minerals, materials that are vital for manufacturing everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to military hardware. Countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo have become central players in this partnership, supplying the lion's share of cobalt used in the global battery industry. Angola, Nigeria, and Sudan have all become important oil suppliers to China. In return, China has financed massive infrastructure projects, such as the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, and dozens of hydroelectric dams. These projects have not only boosted trade and economic output in African countries, but also tied them more closely to China's Belt and Road Initiative, the multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure program designed to create a China-centered global trade network. While Beijing portrays this as a win-win relationship, critics argue that it has created a new kind of dependency. Many African nations now owe significant portions of their external debt to Chinese banks and state-owned enterprises. When countries struggle to repay these loans, China has sometimes negotiated for control over strategic assets, such as ports or mining operations, in what opponents describe as a debt-trap diplomacy strategy. For example, Sri Lanka's controversial Hambantota port deal, while not in Africa, has been used as a cautionary tale for African governments about the risks of allowing debt repayment to result in long-term Chinese control over infrastructure. Nonetheless, many African leaders counter that the West had decades to invest in the continent and failed to deliver, whereas China has built tangible projects that create jobs and spur growth. From China's perspective, Africa is not just about raw materials. It's about securing a strategic advantage in the competition with the West. By investing heavily in African infrastructure, Beijing gains access to major shipping routes, influence in the United Nations through African votes, and control over key commodities. African countries make up a large voting bloc in international organizations, and their support can tilt global decisions in China's favor on issues like trade, technology standards, and human rights. Furthermore, China's military presence in Africa, though still limited compared to the United States, is expanding. The establishment of its first overseas military base in Djibouti in 2017 signaled that Beijing intends to protect its economic interests in the region with force if necessary. The growing China-Africa relationship also has a technological dimension. Chinese companies such as Huawei and ZTE have built telecommunications networks across the continent, laying the groundwork for Africa's 5G future. This gives China both a commercial edge and potential geopolitical leverage, as Western governments increasingly worry about data security and surveillance risks from Chinese technology. Digital infrastructure, just like roads and ports, can bind nations into long-term dependency. For African countries, however, these projects are often the most affordable and fastest way to modernize their communication systems, and rejecting them in favor of Western alternatives would be slower and more expensive. The economic benefits for China are clear. Africa provides an almost endless supply of the raw materials needed for China's manufacturing industries, as well as a growing market for Chinese goods. African cities are expanding rapidly, and middle-class consumers are eager for affordable cars, electronics, and household products, all sectors where Chinese manufacturers excel. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. African nations export resources to China, China uses those resources to manufacture goods, and then those goods are sold back to African consumers. However, the relationship is not without its tensions. There have been protests in several African countries against Chinese mining operations, often over labor conditions, environmental damage, or perceptions that Chinese companies are not employing enough local workers. In some cases, governments have renegotiated contracts or imposed stricter environmental rules, signaling that African leaders are aware of the political risks of being seen as too dependent on China. There is also growing competition from other countries. Turkey, India, Russia, and Gulf states have all increased their presence in Africa in recent years, seeking to counterbalance China's influence. For the United States, China's rise in Africa presents both a challenge and a wake-up call. Washington has recently tried to reinvigorate its African partnerships, offering new trade deals, infrastructure funding through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, and security cooperation programs. But compared to China's fast-moving, construction-heavy approach, the U.S. still moves slowly, hampered by bureaucratic processes and political debates at home. As a result, African leaders often see China as the partner who shows up with money and machinery, while the West shows up with conditions and committees. The China-Africa connection also has global implications beyond economics. Control over Africa's rare earth minerals and energy resources could give China a strategic edge in industries ranging from renewable energy to aerospace and defense. As the world transitions to electric vehicles, wind turbines, and other green technologies, demand for cobalt, lithium, and other critical minerals will only grow, and China is positioning itself to control much of that supply chain. If Beijing succeeds, Western manufacturers may find themselves dependent on Chinese-controlled resources, giving China leverage in future trade disputes or geopolitical standoffs. In addition, the integration of Africa into China's Belt and Road network could reshape global trade routes. Ports in Kenya, Tanzania, and Djibouti could become major hubs for Chinese shipping, bypassing traditional Western-dominated maritime routes. Combined with China's growing influence in the Middle East and South Asia, this creates an alternative trade architecture that diminishes Western control over global commerce. Looking ahead, the China-Africa partnership is likely to deepen. Beijing has made long-term commitments to invest in renewable energy projects across Africa, from solar farms in Egypt to wind projects in Ethiopia. These not only address Africa's growing energy needs, but also align with China's ambitions to dominate the global clean energy industry. At the same time, African governments are learning to negotiate more favorable terms with China, using competition from other nations to secure better deals. Ultimately, the question is not whether China will remain a dominant player in Africa, it's how that dominance will shape the global order in the decades to come. For some, it's a story of mutual growth and opportunity, with China providing the infrastructure Africa needs to leapfrog into the 21st century. For others, it's a cautionary tale about dependency and the risks of concentrating too much economic power in the hands of one foreign partner. What is clear is that Africa has become a central arena in the competition between China and the West, and the outcomes there will reverberate across the world, influencing everything from energy prices to international diplomacy. As both sides continue to court African nations, the continent's leaders hold more power than ever before to shape their own destiny, and to determine which vision of the future they will embrace. Let us know in the comments below. Your opinion matters, and we'd love to hear it. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this breakdown. Subscribe for more in-depth analyses, and share this video. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.